High in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina, hidden behind rolling forests and winding roads, stands a house so large that it defies common sense. Biltmore Estate was never supposed to survive. It was built at the peak of American excess, designed for a world where wealth seemed endless and consequences felt distant. More than 250 rooms, thousands of acres, a private railroad spur, a staff that once numbered in the hundreds. From the moment it was completed, Biltmore existed on borrowed time. History should have erased it the way it erased nearly every other Gilded Age mansion in America. And yet it remains, not as a ruin, not as a forgotten relic, but as a living estate still standing when entire dynasties collapsed around it. When George Washington Vanderbilt, II, completed Biltmore in 1895, it was the largest private home ever built in the United States. European aristocrats found its scale familiar. Americans found it unsettling. This was not a house meant to blend in with a democratic society. It was a statement of permanence in a nation still defining itself. Biltmore was not built for entertaining crowds or impressing the public. It was built as a private refuge for a man who never imagined his wealth could disappear. Like many of his contemporaries, Vanderbilt believed the Gilded Age was not a moment, but a condition that would endure indefinitely. That assumption would prove fatal to almost every estate like it. Within a single generation, industrial fortunes crumbled under new taxes, changing labor laws, public resentment, and economic collapse. Mansions that once symbolized power became financial sinkholes. Families walked away. Properties were subdivided, abandoned, or demolished. Across America, Gilded Age palaces fell one by one, victims of a modern world that no longer tolerated inherited excess. By all rational standards, Biltmore should have shared their fate. The math alone made survival impossible. The estate required constant maintenance. Roofs, plumbing, heating systems, roads, forests, farms. Even empty, it consumed enormous resources. Unlike factories or railroads, Biltmore produced nothing. It was designed to spend money, not generate it. When the Vanderbilt fortune began to thin, the house became a liability of historic proportions. There were moments when selling it seemed inevitable. There were moments when survival was not discussed at all, because no one believed it was possible. And yet, Biltmore endured. Not through luck, not through nostalgia, and not through government rescue. Its survival came from a decision that quietly broke every rule of old money. A decision that transformed a private symbol of excess into something else entirely. But that transformation did not happen overnight, and it came at a cost few families would have accepted. To understand how Biltmore survived when everything like it failed, we must first understand why it was built in the first place. Who George Vanderbilt was, what he believed about wealth, and why his vision created both the greatest vulnerability and the greatest advantage the estate would ever have. Because Biltmore's survival secret was not hidden in its stone walls or vast land holdings. It was hidden in the moment its creators realized that permanence was an illusion and adaptation was the only form of legacy that could last. George Washington Vanderbilt, II, was not the kind of man who built empires through confrontation or ambition. He inherited his position in the world fully formed, born in 1862 into the most powerful family America had ever produced. By the time he reached adulthood, the Vanderbilt name was already synonymous with railroads, shipping, steel, and unimaginable wealth. Cornelius Vanderbilt, his grandfather, had transformed transportation and crushed competitors with ruthless efficiency. His uncles expanded the fortune further, turning industrial dominance into social power. George, by contrast, did not need to conquer anything. His role was different. He was born to enjoy, refine, and preserve what others had built. From an early age, George Vanderbilt gravitated toward ideas rather than enterprises. He was bookish, introverted, and deeply curious. He read constantly, collected art, studied languages, and traveled through Europe absorbing culture rather than deals. While other heirs were trained to expand fortunes, George was shaped by the assumption that the fortune already existed and would continue to exist indefinitely. This distinction matters because Biltmore was not conceived as a business asset, a prestige project, or a symbol of competition. It was conceived as a personal sanctuary for a man who believed wealth was permanent, enough to support beauty for its own sake. In the late 19th century, this belief was not unusual among America's elite. The Gilded Age fostered a dangerous illusion that industrial fortunes once accumulated were immune to erosion. Railroads seemed eternal. Trusts appeared unbreakable. The government had not yet developed the tools or the political will to seriously challenge concentrated wealth. Taxes on inheritance were minimal. Labor unrest was violent but contained. To families like the Vanderbilts, the future looked stable, predictable, and controllable. Building something enormous and expensive did not feel reckless. It felt logical. When George Vanderbilt began visiting Western North Carolina in the late 1880s, he was searching for escape, not recognition. The region's mountains reminded him of Europe. The climate was mild. The land was vast and sparsely populated. Unlike Newport or New York, there was no audience. That isolation was the point. Biltmore was never intended to host society in the way Palm Beach or Newport estates did. It was meant to be private, intellectual, almost monastic in spirit, despite its size. Vanderbilt envisioned a self-contained world where he could read, walk, hunt, and live surrounded by beauty without intrusion. To execute that vision, he hired Richard Morris Hunt, the most prestigious architect in America, and Frederick Law Olmsted, the designer of Central Park. Their involvement signaled seriousness but not practicality. Hunt designed Biltmore as a French Renaissance chateau scaled to American proportions, while Olmsted approached the land not as decorative gardens, but as a managed landscape, forests, farms, and controlled vistas stretching for miles. It was visionary, but it was also expensive beyond comprehension. The estate grew to over 125,000 acres at its peak. Entire villages were absorbed. Roads, rail lines, and utilities were built from scratch. None of this alarmed George Vanderbilt. Why would it? His annual income alone dwarfed the lifetime earnings of most Americans. Maintenance costs were abstract numbers in a world where money replenished itself automatically. Biltmore was not a gamble because George never imagined a scenario where the rules of wealth would change. The house was designed for continuity, not transition. It assumed a future where the Vanderbilt name would always command resources sufficient to sustain it. That assumption embedded a fatal weakness into the estate. Unlike entrepreneurial dynasties that adapted or diversified, the Vanderbilts increasingly treated wealth as heritage rather than function. Biltmore reflected that mindset perfectly. It was magnificent but inflexible, beautiful but economically silent. It required servants, artisans, and managers, but it did not produce returns. It existed in defiance of efficiency, and efficiency was about to become the defining demand of the modern world. Yet within that weakness lay an unexpected advantage. Because Biltmore was not built to impress the public, it was not psychologically bound to exclusivity. It was never a social theater that depended on reputation or access. It was a retreat. That distinction would later allow decisions that other families found unthinkable. While old money culture clung to privacy as identity, Biltmore's identity was rooted in place and continuity, not secrecy. George Vanderbilt himself never lived to see how fragile his assumptions were. He married late in 1898 to Edith Stuyvesant Dresser, and they had one daughter, Cornelia. His health declined quickly. By 1914, at just 51 years old, he was dead. His passing marked the end of the Gilded Age mindset in its purest form. The world he trusted was already disappearing. Income taxes were expanding. Public sentiment had shifted. War loomed. The fortune that seemed eternal now faced pressures it had never encountered. Biltmore, conceived as a monument to permanence, suddenly became a question, not of taste or beauty, but of survival. The estate George Vanderbilt built with total confidence in inherited wealth would now have to exist in a century that no longer respected inheritance as destiny. The very mindset that created Biltmore had ensured it would be unsustainable under new rules. And yet, because it was built without concern for public approval, it could later be reshaped without destroying its essence. Understanding George Vanderbilt is essential to understanding why Biltmore almost failed and why it ultimately endured. He did not build recklessly. He built sincerely according to the logic of his time. Biltmore stands today not because that logic was correct, but because later generations were willing to abandon it. The house survived by rejecting the assumptions of the man who created it, while preserving the vision that made it worth saving. When George Vanderbilt died in 1914, Biltmore did not immediately begin to fail. Instead, it entered a quieter, more dangerous phase, delayed collapse. On the surface, the estate continued to function much as it always had. Servants remained. Grounds were maintained. The house stood immaculate, insulated from the chaos, beginning to reshape the world. But beneath that appearance of continuity, the foundations of the Vanderbilt fortune were already shifting in ways that made Biltmore's long-term survival mathematically impossible. The timing could not have been worse. George Vanderbilt's death coincided with the end of the Gilded Age itself. Within a few years, World War I would redraw global economies. Progressive era reforms expanded government oversight of wealth. Income taxes increased. Estate taxes, once negligible, became unavoidable. The era when inherited fortunes could pass untouched from one generation to the next was over. The Vanderbilt family, once the richest in America, found itself ill-prepared for a system that punished size, visibility, and excess. Edith Vanderbilt, suddenly a widow at 42, inherited responsibility for an estate unlike anything else in the country. She was intelligent, socially adept, and far more pragmatic than her husband. But even she had never been expected to manage something of this scale. Biltmore was not a single property. It was a small kingdom. Thousands of acres of forest required professional management. Farms demanded oversight. The house itself required constant restoration. Roofs leaked. Boilers aged. Mechanical systems built for the 1890s became obsolete almost immediately. Maintaining Biltmore was not a lifestyle. It was an industrial operation disguised as elegance. At the same time, income from the broader Vanderbilt fortune began to erode. Railroads, once unstoppable, faced regulation and competition. Dividends shrank. Costs rose. The family's wealth was still vast, but it was no longer infinite. And unlike many industrialists who reinvested aggressively or diversified, the Vanderbilts had increasingly treated their fortune as something to be spent rather than grown. Biltmore, the most extreme expression of that philosophy, now demanded money that was no longer replenishing itself fast enough. The true crisis, however, was structural. Biltmore had been built for a world where private estates operated in isolation from public accountability. That world no longer existed. Labor expectations changed. Maintaining a staff of hundreds became ethically and financially controversial. Public resentment toward extreme wealth hardened. Mansions once admired as symbols of success became targets of criticism. To keep Biltmore private under these conditions required not just money but justification. And justification was something old money culture was deeply uncomfortable providing. Edith Vanderbilt faced choices her husband never imagined. Selling the estate outright was possible, but deeply unlikely. No private buyer could afford it, and even fewer would want it. Subdividing the land would destroy the integrity of Olmsted's design. Abandonment was unthinkable, but increasingly discussed in whispers. Biltmore was not yet failing, but it was no longer sustainable under its original purpose. Every year it remained unchanged. The problem grew larger. Then came the Great Depression. And with it, the moment when Biltmore's survival shifted from improbable to almost miraculous. Financial markets collapsed. Trusts evaporated. Income streams dried up. Across America, great houses closed their doors permanently. Families auctioned furniture, sold art, and retreated into smaller, manageable homes. Entire estates vanished in a matter of years. In Europe, aristocratic properties fell into disrepair or state ownership. In America, they were demolished with shocking speed. Biltmore did not escape unscathed. The cost of maintaining the estate now far exceeded its income. Taxes alone became crushing. For the first time, the idea that Biltmore might be lost became public. Newspapers speculated. Locals worried. The house that had once symbolized permanence now seemed fragile, even absurd. How could a private family justify preserving a palace while the country struggled to survive? It was during this period that Edith Vanderbilt made the decision that would change everything. In 1930, she opened Biltmore House to the public for the first time. This was not framed as tourism. It was framed as necessity. Admission fees would help cover maintenance costs and keep the estate operational. For old money families, this was nearly unthinkable. Privacy was identity. Opening one's home to strangers was seen as humiliation, a public admission of decline. Many families would rather destroy their houses than allow outsiders to walk through them. But Biltmore was different. Because it had never been built as a social stage, opening it did not feel like betrayal. There were no legendary balls to cheapen, no exclusive guest list to undermine. The house's meaning was architectural and environmental, not social. By allowing public access, Edith Vanderbilt quietly transformed Biltmore from a private liability into a semi-public asset. It was no longer just a house. It was an experience, a destination, a piece of American heritage. This decision did not solve everything. In the short term, it barely slowed the bleeding. But it changed the narrative. Biltmore was no longer an indulgence hoarded by a single family. It became a shared cultural object. Visitors did not resent it. They admired it. They paid to see it. And in paying, they justified its existence. That justification would become Biltmore's greatest protection in the decades to come. Still, the estate remained under enormous strain. Portions of the land were sold to reduce tax burdens. The original acreage shrank dramatically. What had once been a private wilderness was now carefully preserved core property surrounded by development. These sales were painful but strategic. Unlike families who liquidated art and furniture to maintain appearances, the Vanderbilts prioritized the survival of the house itself. Everything else was negotiable. By the time Cornelia Vanderbilt inherited control, the illusion of inherited permanence was completely gone. She did not grow up assuming wealth was eternal. She grew up watching it contract. Her decisions would further distance Biltmore from its original purpose but bring it closer to survival. The estate would continue to adapt, not because tradition demanded it, but because reality forced it. Section 3 of Biltmore's story is not about collapse, but about the moment collapse became unavoidable unless something fundamental changed. It is the period where denial ended and strategy began. Biltmore survived not because it resisted the modern world, but because it confronted it earlier than most. The mansion was too large, too expensive, and too visible to remain frozen in the past. Its survival required sacrifice, humility, and a willingness to redefine what legacy meant in a century that no longer protected the old rules. By the time Cornelia Vanderbilt inherited Biltmore, the estate no longer represented triumph. It represented responsibility. Born into a house designed to outlast centuries, she instead inherited it at a moment when history had turned hostile toward everything it symbolized. Cornelia did not grow up believing Biltmore was untouchable. She watched, year after year, as its scale became a burden rather than a blessing. The silence of its halls was no longer peaceful. It was accusatory. Every room asked the same question: how long can this continue? Cornelia came of age during a period when old money families across America were quietly surrendering. Mansions closed. Estates were sold off in parcels. Heirs moved into apartments and townhouses, choosing mobility over maintenance. Unlike her grandfather or father, Cornelia understood that prestige no longer protected wealth. Inheritance had become fragile. Public opinion had shifted decisively against excess. The Vanderbilts, once untouchable, were now a cautionary tale whispered about in financial columns and society pages alike. Her marriage to John Francis, Amherst Cecil in 1924 symbolized a final attempt to anchor Biltmore within aristocratic tradition. Cecil, a British diplomat, represented an older European model of land, lineage, and endurance. On paper, it made sense. European estates had survived centuries of political upheaval. Perhaps that model could still work in America. But the reality was far less romantic. Britain's aristocracy was itself declining, and Cecil brought status, not solutions. Biltmore remained American in its costs and unforgiving in its demands. As the Great Depression deepened, Cornelia faced choices that few heirs before her had ever confronted. Maintaining Biltmore as a private residence was no longer merely expensive. It was irrational. The estate consumed resources at a time when public scrutiny of wealth had hardened into resentment. To persist unchanged would not preserve legacy. It would destroy it. And yet, abandoning Biltmore entirely would erase the very thing that made the Vanderbilt name meaningful in the first place. The solution required something: old money. Families instinctively resisted reinvention. Not cosmetic change, but structural transformation. Biltmore could no longer exist as a monument to private wealth. It had to justify itself in public terms. This meant formalizing tourism, expanding accessibility, and reshaping the estate's identity from inherited privilege to national treasure. The shift was subtle, but profound. Biltmore was no longer presented as a family home that outsiders were temporarily allowed to see. It became a cultural institution that happened to remain under private ownership. This transformation demanded professionalization. Operations were reorganized. Marketing was introduced carefully, avoiding vulgarity but embracing visibility. The estate's agricultural operations, long treated as experimental hobbies, were reframed as productive enterprises. Forestry management became a model for sustainable land use, drawing academic interest and governmental respect. Each decision pushed Biltmore further from its origins and closer to survival. There was a cost to this evolution that is often overlooked. Reinvention meant relinquishing control. The estate no longer existed solely for the family's pleasure. It existed for visitors, employees, historians, and the broader public. Privacy diminished. The house became performative, its rooms curated not for living but for interpretation. This was a psychological sacrifice as much as a financial one. Biltmore survived because it stopped pretending it was still a private world. Cornelia's eventual decision to leave Biltmore permanently was not a failure. It was an acknowledgement of reality. She relocated, allowing the estate to operate independently of her daily presence. This separation was crucial. By removing the illusion that Biltmore was still a family residence, she allowed it to fully transition into its new role. Many estates failed precisely because heirs could not let go of that illusion. They clung to private use while public costs mounted, until nothing remained to save. The Cecil family's continued involvement ensured continuity without sentimentality. Management replaced nostalgia. Decisions were judged by sustainability rather than tradition. Over time, Biltmore's identity stabilized. It was no longer pretending to be what it had been in 1895. It was becoming something new, a hybrid entity that balanced heritage, commerce, and conservation. Section 4 marks the moment when Biltmore stopped fighting history and began cooperating with it. Survival did not come from stubbornness or pride, but from adaptation. Cornelia Vanderbilt's greatest contribution was not preservation in the traditional sense. It was acceptance. Acceptance that the old rules were gone, that legacy had to be earned continuously, and that endurance required change. In letting go of the fantasy of permanence, she gave Biltmore its first real chance at permanence at all. From this point forward, the question was no longer whether Biltmore could survive, but what kind of institution it would become. The answer would determine not just the fate of the house, but whether America could learn to preserve its past without being trapped by it. As Biltmore's identity shifted from private estate to public institution, its survival entered a new and far more complex phase. Opening the doors to visitors had saved the house from immediate collapse, but it also exposed a deeper truth. Admiration alone could not sustain something of this scale. Tourism brought attention, but attention did not equal stability. To endure, Biltmore had to evolve beyond being a monument people walked through once and remembered fondly. It needed to become a living economic system, capable of supporting itself year after year, without relying on nostalgia or inherited wealth. The challenge was unprecedented. No private residence in America had ever attempted to operate permanently as both historic landmark and financial enterprise. Biltmore was too large to function as a museum in the traditional sense and too historically significant to become a commercial attraction stripped of meaning. Every decision carried risk. Too much commercialization would cheapen the estate and alienate its core audience. Too little would leave it financially vulnerable. The margin for error was small, and the consequences of failure were irreversible. The solution emerged slowly through a series of deliberate choices that prioritized resilience over purity. The estate's agricultural roots, once dismissed as gentlemanly experiments, were reimagined as foundational assets. Farming operations were modernized, vineyards expanded, and production scaled with care. This was not a return to subsistence farming, but a recognition that land properly managed could generate revenue without undermining heritage. The estate's size, once its greatest liability, became its greatest advantage. Forestry management followed a similar path. Frederick Law Olmsted's original vision of managed forests had been decades ahead of its time. Now it aligned perfectly with emerging conservation principles. Biltmore positioned itself as a model of sustainable land use, attracting scholars, policymakers, and environmentalists. This shift reframed the estate in the public imagination. It was no longer just a relic of excess. It was a working landscape contributing to modern conversations about stewardship and responsibility. Inside the house, interpretation replaced display. Rooms were no longer presented as frozen tableaux of wealth, but as narratives of craftsmanship, technology, and labor. Visitors were invited to understand not just what Biltmore looked like, but how it functioned and why it mattered. This subtle reframing elevated the experience. It transformed passive observation into engagement. People did not simply admire the house. They participated in its story. Crucially, Biltmore resisted the temptation to romanticize its past uncritically. The estate did not hide the costs of its construction or the social realities of its era. Servant life, industrial wealth, and class division were acknowledged rather than erased. This honesty built credibility. In an age increasingly skeptical of inherited privilege, transparency became a form of protection. Biltmore survived not by pretending it represented a golden age, but by contextualizing that age within a broader historical reality. Economic diversification became the estate's quiet revolution. Hospitality ventures were introduced not as concessions, but as extensions of place. Inns and accommodations were designed to harmonize with the landscape, reinforcing rather than competing with the estate's identity. Events, exhibitions, and seasonal programming created repeat visitation, transforming Biltmore from a one-time destination into an evolving experience. Revenue streams multiplied, each reinforcing the others. Behind the scenes, governance evolved as well. Family stewardship gave way to professional management structures. Decisions were driven by long-term sustainability metrics rather than personal attachment. This transition was essential. Many historic estates failed because heirs could not separate emotion from strategy. Biltmore's survival depended on doing exactly that. Heritage became a responsibility, not a possession. There were moments when this balance nearly failed. Economic downturns tested resilience. Shifts in tourism patterns forced recalibration. Cultural attitudes toward wealth and history continued to evolve. But each challenge reinforced the same lesson. Survival required constant adaptation. Biltmore did not endure because it reached a perfect state. It endured because it treated permanence as a process, not a condition. Over time, the estate achieved something rare. It became profitable without becoming cynical, popular without becoming shallow, revered without becoming irrelevant. This equilibrium was fragile and required constant maintenance, but it proved that scale itself was not the enemy. Inflexibility was. Biltmore's size no longer condemned it. It protected it, provided it continued to evolve. What emerged was not the survival of a mansion, but the reinvention of an idea. Biltmore demonstrated that the legacy of extreme wealth could be preserved without glorifying excess. That private ambition could be transformed into public value. That adaptation, when guided by respect rather than fear, could extend the life of even the most impractical creations. By this stage, Biltmore was no longer surviving in spite of its past. It was surviving because it had learned from it. The estate's greatest secret was no longer hidden in family decisions or financial maneuvering. It was embedded in a philosophy that treated history as a foundation, not a cage. And that philosophy would ensure that Biltmore remained standing long after its contemporaries existed only in photographs and footnotes. By the late 20th century, Biltmore had crossed an invisible threshold. It was no longer a fragile survivor clinging to relevance, nor merely a preserved artifact from another age. It had become an institution with momentum. This phase of its existence was defined not by rescue or reinvention, but by consolidation, turning decades of adaptation into a durable system capable of weathering cultural, economic, and generational change. Survival was no longer about avoiding collapse. It was about resisting stagnation. One of the most significant shifts during this period was the estate's understanding of time. Earlier generations fought time, trying to freeze Biltmore in an imagined golden moment. Now, time was treated as an ally. Restoration projects no longer aimed to return rooms to a single year or aesthetic. Instead, they acknowledged layers. Materials were conserved, not replaced. Wear was documented, not erased. The house was allowed to age honestly, reinforcing its credibility as a living structure rather than a theatrical set. This philosophy extended beyond architecture into storytelling. Biltmore's narrative matured. It stopped centering solely on George Vanderbilt's vision and began exploring the broader ecosystem that made the estate function. Craftsmen, servants, foresters, farmers, architects, and engineers moved from the margins of interpretation to its core. This shift mattered deeply. It redistributed significance away from a single elite figure and toward collective effort. In doing so, Biltmore aligned itself with modern historical values without sacrificing its identity. At the same time, the estate confronted a new kind of threat: irrelevance. As generations passed, fewer visitors arrived with personal fascination for the Gilded Age. Younger audiences demanded context, meaning, and emotional resonance. Grandeur alone no longer guaranteed engagement. Biltmore responded not by simplifying its story, but by deepening it. Exhibitions expanded into themes of technology, labor, environmental management, and American identity. The house became a lens through which visitors could understand broader forces that shaped a nation. Economic sustainability evolved in parallel. The estate recognized that resilience required anticipation, not reaction. Revenue diversification continued, but with greater sophistication. The wine operation expanded into a fully integrated brand, tying product directly to place. Hospitality offerings became immersive rather than transactional, emphasizing experience over luxury alone. Seasonal programming transformed the estate's rhythm, ensuring relevance year-round rather than during peak tourist windows. Crucially, none of this occurred at the expense of restraint. Biltmore resisted overdevelopment even when expansion promised short-term gains. Land preservation remained central. Views were protected. The estate's physical boundaries became symbolic as well as geographic signaling that growth would never come at the cost of character. This discipline distinguished Biltmore from commercial attractions that burned brightly and faded quickly. Governance during this era reflected maturity. Family ownership persisted, but not as control in the traditional sense. It functioned as stewardship, guided by professional expertise and long-term planning. Decisions were made with generational horizons, not quarterly returns. This perspective insulated Biltmore from market volatility and cultural trends that destabilized less grounded institutions. The estate also embraced its role as educator. Partnerships with universities, conservation organizations, and cultural institutions expanded Biltmore's influence beyond tourism. Research, internships, and collaborative programs positioned the estate as a contributor to knowledge, not merely a consumer of attention. This intellectual legitimacy further protected it from becoming a curiosity frozen in time. Perhaps most importantly, Biltmore learned how to say no. Not every opportunity aligned with its mission. Not every audience needed to be captured. This selective approach preserved coherence. In a world obsessed with scale and reach, Biltmore prioritized depth. It chose to matter deeply to fewer people rather than superficially to many. That choice reinforced trust and loyalty, qualities far more valuable than fleeting popularity. By this stage, Biltmore's survival was no longer miraculous. It was instructive. The estate had become a case study in how inherited structures, physical, cultural, and economic, could be adapted without erasure. Its continued existence challenged the assumption that extreme wealth must either be glorified or condemned. Instead, it suggested a third path, transformation through responsibility. What endured was not the fantasy of the Gilded Age, but its material reality, reframed for a society that no longer accepted inherited privilege without accountability. Biltmore stood because it acknowledged its contradictions rather than hiding them. Grandeur and restraint, wealth and labor, beauty and cost. By holding these tensions in balance, the estate secured its place in the present. Section 6 of Biltmore's story is the quietest, but also the most decisive. It is the moment when survival becomes continuity, when adaptation becomes instinct, when the question is no longer whether the house will stand tomorrow, but how it will remain meaningful decades from now. Biltmore did not outlast its peers by accident. It did so by learning, patiently and relentlessly, how to live inside time instead of trying to defeat it. Today, Biltmore stands not as a contradiction to history, but as its negotiation. It is the last great American mansion of its kind, not because it was the grandest, but because it was the most adaptable. What once symbolized unchecked wealth now survives as a carefully balanced system, shaped by more than a century of pressure, compromise, and deliberate choice. Its continued existence forces an uncomfortable but necessary question. Why did this one endure when nearly all others failed? The answer is not romance. It is discipline. Biltmore survived because it surrendered the illusion that legacy is static. Where other estates clung to privacy until the cost became unbearable, Biltmore accepted exposure early. Where others treated land as decoration, Biltmore treated it as responsibility. Where tradition demanded preservation at all costs, Biltmore chose transformation with restraint. These decisions were not heroic in the moment. They were controversial, often criticized, and deeply uncomfortable for a family raised to equate withdrawal with dignity. What remains today is not a house, frozen in 1895, but a structure that carries the imprint of every decade it has survived. Its walls have absorbed economic collapse, war, cultural revolt, and generational change. Its survival is not a testament to wealth alone, but to management, foresight, and a willingness to abandon sentiment when sentiment threatens survival. That willingness is what separated Biltmore from the ruins of its peers. The estate's greatest secret was never hidden in its scale or craftsmanship. It was hidden in its acceptance of limits. Biltmore learned to live within constraints rather than deny them. Financial, cultural, environmental, and ethical boundaries were acknowledged and respected. This discipline allowed it to grow resilient rather than brittle. In contrast, many Gilded Age estates failed precisely because they were built to dominate rather than endure. Biltmore also benefited from timing, but not in the way most assume. It was built late, at the very end of the Gilded Age, when excess had reached its peak. That lateness meant it encountered collapse sooner, while adaptation was still possible. Estates built earlier had decades to accumulate inertia. By the time crisis arrived, they were too rigid to change. Biltmore's confrontation with reality came early enough to force evolution. Before collapse became inevitable, its survival reshaped how Americans think about heritage. Biltmore proved that preservation does not require worship and that access does not destroy meaning. By opening itself to the public, it democratized something originally built for isolation. In doing so, it reframed ownership as stewardship and legacy as service. This shift aligned the estate with modern values without erasing its past. Yet, Biltmore's story is not a universal blueprint. It survived because it had advantages others did not: scale, location, artistic coherence, and early engagement with land management. Many estates lacked these assets and could not replicate its path even if they wanted to. Biltmore's lesson is not that all legacies can be saved, but that those worth saving must evolve or accept extinction. The mansion's endurance also complicates narratives about old money. It neither glorifies nor condemns inherited wealth. Instead, it exposes its fragility. Biltmore exists because its caretakers recognized that inheritance is not permanent. It is a temporary condition that demands justification anew in every generation. When justification ends, survival ends. As visitors walk its corridors today, they are not stepping into a fantasy of eternal privilege. They are walking through the residue of decisions made under pressure. Every preserved room reflects a choice to maintain rather than abandon. Every open gate reflects a decision to share rather than hide. Biltmore stands because someone, at every turning point, chose adaptation over pride. In the end, Biltmore did not escape history. It submitted to it. That submission, paradoxically, is what allowed it to remain standing. In a country that once built monuments to wealth and then demolished them without hesitation, Biltmore offers a different ending. Not triumph, not collapse, but continuity earned through change. The estate's survival secret is not mysterious, and it is not comforting. It tells us that nothing, no matter how grand, survives unchanged. It tells us that legacy is not preserved by resisting the future, but by negotiating with it. And it tells us that even the most impractical creations can endure, if they are willing to become something their creators never imagined. Long after Biltmore proved it could survive economically and culturally, a quieter question began to define its future. What responsibility does a monument of extreme wealth carry in a century defined by inequality, environmental anxiety, and historical reckoning? Survival alone was no longer enough. Endurance without purpose risked becoming spectacle. For Biltmore to remain legitimate, it had to confront not only how it was built and preserved, but what it meant to exist at all in a modern moral landscape. This phase of Biltmore's life unfolded under a new kind of scrutiny. Visitors no longer arrived only to admire scale and beauty. They arrived with questions. Who built this place? Who maintained it? Who benefited? And who bore the cost? These questions were not hostile, but they were persistent. Across museums and historic estates worldwide, audiences demanded honesty over reverence. Biltmore could either resist this shift and risk irrelevance, or engage it and reshape its meaning yet again. The estate chose engagement. Interpretation deepened, not softened. The narrative expanded to include labor systems, domestic service, and the invisible infrastructure that made elite life possible. Servants' corridors, workspaces, and routines were no longer footnotes. They became central to understanding how Biltmore functioned. This was a profound shift. For generations, great houses told stories upward, focusing on patrons and architects. Biltmore began telling its story outward and downward, acknowledging the thousands of lives intertwined with its existence. This honesty did not diminish the estate's appeal. It strengthened it. Visitors did not feel deceived or excluded. They felt trusted. By revealing the full cost of grandeur, Biltmore transformed admiration into reflection. The house became a place where beauty and discomfort could coexist, where awe did not require ignorance. That balance proved essential in a cultural moment. Increasingly wary of sanitized history, environmental responsibility emerged as another defining dimension of legitimacy. Climate awareness reframed how large landowners were judged. Biltmore's vast acreage, once criticized as excess, now carried potential for leadership. Conservation practices intensified. Forestry management emphasized biodiversity, resilience, and long-term ecological health. Agricultural operations aligned with sustainability rather than yield alone. These were not symbolic gestures. They were operational commitments that required investment, expertise, and restraint. The estate's relationship with the surrounding region also evolved. Biltmore was no longer an isolated enclave overlooking a struggling local economy. It became a major employer, cultural anchor, and environmental steward. This role carried weight. Decisions made on the estate rippled outward, affecting livelihoods, land use, and regional identity. Biltmore's survival became intertwined with the well-being of the place it occupied, reinforcing a principle its founders never articulated, but its successors embraced: isolation is not resilience. At the same time, Biltmore resisted the urge to recast itself as a moral authority. It did not claim redemption or virtue. It acknowledged contradiction. It presented itself as a product of its time, preserved by later generations who made different choices under different pressures. This refusal to simplify its story preserved credibility. Biltmore did not ask to be forgiven. It asked to be understood. As debates over wealth, inheritance, and privilege intensified nationwide, Biltmore occupied an unusual position. It was an artifact of inequality that survived by making itself useful. Not profitable alone, but educational, environmental, and cultural. This utility did not erase its origins, but it contextualized them. Biltmore became evidence that inherited structures can be repurposed without denial or destruction. This transformation also protected the estate from politicization. By grounding its relevance in tangible contributions rather than symbolism, Biltmore avoided becoming a proxy battlefield for ideological disputes. It was not celebrated as proof that old money was justified, nor condemned as evidence it was immoral. It existed in between, as a case study rather than a slogan. That neutrality, carefully maintained, allowed it to endure cultural swings that destabilized less nuanced institutions. Internally, this period demanded humility. Management accepted that no version of Biltmore's story would ever feel complete or final. Interpretation remained flexible, open to revision as scholarship evolved and values shifted. This openness prevented stagnation. The estate remained responsive rather than defensive, a rare posture for a property rooted in inherited authority. What emerged was a form of legitimacy grounded not in ownership, but in accountability. Biltmore did not survive because it insisted on its right to exist. It survived because it continuously answered the question of why it should. That answer changed over time, but the act of answering never stopped. In this stage of its life, Biltmore ceased to be merely an exception among Gilded Age estates. It became a reference point. Scholars, preservationists, and cultural institutions studied it not for its architecture alone, but for its governance, ethics, and adaptability. Its survival was no longer just impressive. It was instructive. The mansion still towers over its landscape, as imposing as ever. But its true strength now lies elsewhere. It lies in the willingness to be examined, challenged, and reinterpreted. Biltmore stands not because it escaped judgment, but because it faced it repeatedly and chose to evolve. In doing so, it revealed a deeper truth about survival. Endurance is not achieved by defending the past. It is achieved by engaging the present honestly enough to deserve a future. As the 21st century advanced, Biltmore entered its most uncertain era, yet not because it was failing, but because the standards by which survival was judged had changed again. Economic sustainability and historical relevance were no longer sufficient shields. Institutions were now measured by transparency, inclusivity, and adaptability in a rapidly accelerating world. The question facing Biltmore was no longer whether it could endure pressure, but whether it could remain meaningful in a culture that was learning to distrust monuments altogether. The pace of change itself became a threat. Digital culture shortened attention spans and altered how people engage with history. Audiences no longer accepted passive consumption. They wanted interaction, narrative depth, and emotional resonance. A house, no matter how grand, could no longer rely on physical presence alone to hold attention. Biltmore responded by reframing experience as dialogue. Technology was integrated carefully, not to replace the estate's substance, but to illuminate it. Digital archives, interpretive media, and behind-the-scenes access extended the story beyond walls and rooms, allowing engagement to continue long after a visit ended. This expansion into new forms of storytelling carried risk. Too much modernization could fracture authenticity. Too little would render the estate invisible to future generations. Biltmore navigated this tension with characteristic restraint, treating technology as a tool rather than a spectacle. The goal was not to compete with entertainment culture, but to offer depth that entertainment could not. In doing so, the estate positioned itself as an antidote to ephemerality, a place where complexity was not reduced, but revealed. At the same time, demographic change reshaped the audience itself. Visitors arrived with vastly different cultural reference points than those of earlier decades. For many, the Gilded Age was not a familiar chapter of national mythology, but a distant abstraction. Biltmore adapted by anchoring its narrative less in elite biography and more in universal themes: ambition, labor, innovation, and consequence. The estate became a case study in systems rather than individuals, allowing people from different backgrounds to find relevance without requiring admiration. This period also forced Biltmore to confront the fragility of physical preservation in an era of environmental volatility. Climate change introduced new uncertainties, intensified storms, shifting ecosystems, and long-term risk to historic structures. Conservation strategies grew more proactive, emphasizing resilience over restoration alone. Infrastructure was reinforced quietly, often invisibly, to protect against threats that earlier generations never imagined. Survival now depended on foresight at a scale even George Vanderbilt could not have conceived. Financially, the estate faced pressures that mirrored broader global instability. Tourism fluctuated. Markets shifted unpredictably. Long-term planning required flexibility without compromising mission. Biltmore responded by strengthening its internal culture of continuity. Institutional memory was preserved deliberately, ensuring that knowledge passed forward rather than disappearing with individuals. This emphasis on continuity protected the estate from the volatility that undermined less prepared organizations. Culturally, Biltmore occupied an increasingly rare position. It was one of the few places where Americans could physically encounter the scale of wealth that once shaped their country. That visibility carried responsibility. Rather than retreating from critique, the estate leaned into context. Discussions of inequality, industrial capitalism, and social hierarchy were framed not as accusations, but as historical realities with modern echoes. Biltmore became a space where difficult conversations could unfold without polemic. This willingness to engage complexity insulated the estate from cultural backlash. While other historic symbols were simplified, politicized, or erased, Biltmore remained intact by refusing to present itself as simple. Its story resisted slogans. It required patience. That demand filtered its audience, attracting those willing to think rather than react. In an era of polarization, this neutrality was not passive. It was intentional. Internally, leadership recognized that endurance required humility. No generation claimed to have perfected the formula. Strategies were tested, revised, and sometimes abandoned. Failure was treated as data rather than disgrace. This mindset prevented the rigidity that had doomed so many legacy institutions. Biltmore's survival continued not because it avoided mistakes, but because it learned faster than the pressures acting against it. The estate's relationship with its past also matured. Instead of seeking to resolve historical contradictions, it allowed them to remain visible. Wealth and labor, beauty and exploitation, vision and cost all coexisted without forced reconciliation. This honesty preserved trust. Visitors sensed that they were not being guided toward a conclusion, but invited into inquiry. As public trust in institutions declined broadly, Biltmore's consistency became an asset. It did not chase trends. It did not reinvent itself theatrically with each cultural shift. It evolved incrementally, guided by principles refined over decades. That steadiness conveyed seriousness. In a world increasingly skeptical of permanence, Biltmore demonstrated that endurance was still possible if it was earned continuously. What distinguished this era from earlier ones was the absence of crisis as catalyst. Change was no longer reactive. It was anticipatory. Biltmore did not wait for collapse, backlash, or decline to force adaptation. It adapted because adaptation had become its identity. Survival was no longer a response to threat. It was a posture. By this stage, the estate's endurance was no longer surprising. It was expected, and that expectation carried its own burden. Biltmore had become proof that preservation could coexist with relevance. That proof raised standards for other institutions, whether they welcomed the comparison or not. Biltmore was no longer merely surviving history. It was shaping how history itself could be carried forward. The mansion still stands as it always has, vast, intricate, and unapologetically monumental. But its true durability now lies in something less visible. It lies in systems, values, and decisions layered over time. In the refusal to become defensive. In the willingness to be examined. In the understanding that survival is not something achieved once, but something renewed every day. In this era, Biltmore's greatest achievement is not that it remains standing, but that it remains responsive. It has learned that permanence is not the absence of change, but the capacity to absorb it without losing coherence. And that lesson, more than any architectural detail, is what allows the estate to face an uncertain future without fear. In the end, Biltmore's survival is not a celebration of wealth, but a study in limits. It is the story of a structure that was never meant to last in the world that followed it, and yet learned how to exist within that world by surrendering the very assumptions that created it. What stands today is not the triumph of the Gilded Age, but its afterlife shaped, constrained, and redefined by a century that refused to accommodate inherited excess without purpose. Biltmore forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about legacy. Most legacies fail not because they are attacked, but because they are protected too rigidly. The great houses that vanished were not destroyed by hostility alone. They collapsed under the weight of their own inflexibility. Their owners believed that preserving form was the same as preserving meaning. Biltmore survived because it learned, early and repeatedly, that meaning must be renegotiated, not defended. This is why the estate story resonates beyond architecture or family history. It mirrors the broader American struggle with permanence in a society built on change. America does not preserve easily. It builds, expands, discards, and moves on. In that context, Biltmore's endurance feels almost unnatural. And yet, it aligns perfectly with a deeper American pattern, reinvention. The estate did not survive by remaining what it was. It survived by becoming something else again and again, without erasing its origin. What is often misunderstood is that this transformation was never complete. There was no final version of Biltmore that solved all contradictions. Each generation inherited a set of unresolved tensions and chose how to live with them. Wealth and access, privacy and openness, preservation and adaptation. At every stage, the estate existed in balance rather than resolution. That balance was fragile, but it was enough. The mansion's continued presence also challenges simplistic judgments about the past. It neither asked to be admired uncritically nor condemned reflexively. Instead, it stands as evidence. Evidence of what extreme wealth could create. Evidence of what it cost. Evidence of how those creations behave once the systems that supported them disappear. Biltmore survives not as an endorsement of its origins, but as a record of consequences managed responsibly over time. There is a temptation to frame Biltmore as inevitable in retrospect, as though its survival was written into its stone. It was not. At numerous points, the rational decision would have been to let it go, to sell it, dismantle it, or reduce it to memory. That it remains standing is the result of repeated choices made under pressure, often without certainty, often against tradition. Survival was never guaranteed. It was argued for, invested in, and earned, What Biltmore ultimately reveals is that scale alone does not doom a legacy. Arrogance is. The estate was massive, costly, and conspicuous, but it learned humility. It learned to justify itself, to listen, to adjust. Many of its contemporaries never did. They mistook silence for dignity and collapse for honor. Biltmore chose exposure over disappearance, accountability over retreat. Today, as societies around the world debate what to preserve and what to let fall away, Biltmore offers a rare example of continuity without denial. It shows that preservation is not an act of freezing time, but of curating change. That stewardship is not ownership extended indefinitely, but responsibility renewed continuously. That endurance requires letting go of the idea that anything deserves to last by default, that the estate's true survival secret is therefore not architectural brilliance, land management, or financial strategy alone. It is psychological. Biltmore survived because the people responsible for it accepted impermanence as a condition, not a threat. They understood that to carry something forward, you must allow it to evolve beyond your control. In a world increasingly suspicious of monuments, Biltmore remains standing not because it insists on reverence, but because it invites understanding. It does not ask to be spared. It asks to be examined. And in doing so, it earns the right to remain. That is why Biltmore is still here when so many others are not. It was too big to fail only after it learned that nothing is too big to disappear.